Welcome back to our series, Anglicanism 101. I'm Dr. Kyle Hughes. In this installment of Anglicanism 101, we will answer the question, what is Anglican spirituality? In other words, we will explore what it means to practice the Christian faith according to the Anglican way. We will find that traditional Anglican spirituality is rooted in the prayer book and is embodied in what is often called the Threefold Rule. First, prayer book spirituality. The Book of Common Prayer is, along with the Bible, the anchoring text for Anglican spirituality. We could say, for instance, that the BCP is the Bible arranged for worship, because about 87% of the text of the BCP is taken from direct quotations of Scripture, and the rest is largely a paraphrase of the Bible. And so the Book of Common Prayer does not stand in competition with the Bible. Rather, it ensures the Bible's place in our worship and in our lives. And the BCP helps us use a more dignified, formal, and precise language appropriate for worship. Now, the Book of Common Prayer is designed for common prayer, hence the name. As the ACNA itself says, the Book of Common Prayer is a standard for Anglican doctrine and discipline. It's the standard for our tradition of worship. Now, the BCP introduced worship in the language of the people, in English as opposed to Latin, thus making worship available and accessible to all people, a major highlight of the Reformation. Using the prayer book connects us then to centuries of Anglicans before us, and it safeguards our worship against our personal preferences or modern trends. Now, briefly, we can set out the major divisions of the 1928 Book of Common Prayer, which encompass private devotion and public worship for all circumstances and signs of life. At the beginning, we see the order for daily worship. We receive the order for morning prayer, evening prayer, and a list of additional optional prayers and thanksgivings. And then we expand outward to weekly worship. And in the next section of the prayer book, we get the liturgy for Holy Communion. The prayer book also gives us a series of propers, meaning the collect and the readings for each Sunday of the liturgical year, named according to its place in the church calendar or other major feast day. Then, in the middle of the prayer book, we get a set of special services. And the prayer book walks us through the services for baptism, confirmation, marriage, for after childbirth, in a time of sickness, and after death. Then the prayer book prints the entirety of the Psalter. This demonstrates how important the Psalms are in the life of Anglican worship. Finally, we get a set of appendices, including things like the 39 articles. Now, the Book of Common Prayer has gone through a long series of editions. And it's worth noting, there are now different prayer books used in different parts of the Anglican world today. So briefly on this process. In 1549, the first comprehensive English language Book of Common Prayer was published. And it was largely carried over many features from Roman Catholicism. But in 1552, at the time of Edward VI, a new edition was published in a more Protestant direction, seen especially in the rite for Holy Communion. But in 1559, at the time of the Elizabethan settlement, they made a light revision of 1552 with a few concessions to the old 1549 edition. So, for instance, they combined the words of administration from the more Roman Catholic 1549 prayer book with the more Protestant 1552 prayer book. In 1662, the English Church made a light revision of the previous prayer book, and this 1662 prayer book has set the standard as the classical Anglican liturgy. And in fact, the 1662 prayer book is still the official liturgy of the Church of England today. Now, the Church of England came to the United States, and after the colonial period, at the time of independence, the American Church, which we'll now call the Episcopal Church, broke off from the Church of England, and this required some revisions to their prayer book. And so in 1789, the first US prayer book was issued, with some interesting changes from the older English ones. For instance, this prayer book left out the Athanasian Creed. It left out some bits about marriage, and it added services for the visitation of prisoners and family prayer. The consecration prayer and Holy Communion was adjusted to align more with the 1764 Scottish form. After all, the independent Scottish Episcopal Church had been the one that consecrated the first American bishops in 1784. And this included things like adding the prayer of oblation in the Eucharistic rite and using more sacrificial language in the prayer of consecration. In 1892, the US prayer book was lightly revised. This added the canticles Magnificat and Nunc Dimittis to morning and evening prayer. In 1928, the US Church issued another light revision of the prayer book in a more Anglo-Catholic direction. For instance, priests were more explicitly instructed to celebrate the Eucharist ad orientem, the eastward position. It added things like prayers for the departed, and it said that the newly baptized should be signed with the cross. In 1979, the US Episcopal Church made a major revision to the prayer book tradition under the influence of the liturgical movement. It increased congregational participation in liturgy. It added new pastoral offices and liturgies for all 3 days of Easter. And by and large, it tended to de-emphasize human sinfulness. It also broke the tradition of common prayer by having multiple rites and prayer options included. And so for many Anglicans, the 1979 prayer book was not adopted. Now, after the formation of the Anglican Church in North America, the ACNA created its own prayer book that was a combination of some of the better features of 1979 with some of the classical prayer book tradition. And in 2019, the ACNA issued its own prayer book, which also included a revised Coverdale Psalter. The second part of this video is the Threefold Rule. Now, in the traditional Anglican way, we pursue a life in God for the sake of the world by embracing what's commonly known as the Threefold Rule. And like it sounds, this is a rule for living that has 3 parts. First, celebrating weekly communion. Second, praying the daily office, morning and evening prayer as found in the prayer book. And third, the practice of personal devotion, either through formal spiritual direction or through spiritual friendships. Now, this threefold rule is often compared to a fence, which has large vertical posts at the end, smaller posts in between, and then long horizontal beams that connect the posts together. Now, in this analogy, the big posts are the weekly celebration of the Eucharist. The smaller posts are the daily office, and the horizontal beams are the various practices of personal devotion. Together, this creates an integrated approach to the spiritual life that connects the corporate life of the church into the daily life of each individual Christian. This also helps us get at the cycle of the liturgical year, which walks us through the seasons of Advent, Christmas, Epiphany, Lent, Easter, Pentecost, and Trinity. The liturgical year helps give shape to our application of the threefold rule throughout the year. For instance, particular private devotions, such as fasting and almsgiving, are encouraged, especially during the penitential seasons of Advent and Lent. Now, many of these spiritual disciplines, such as fasting and almsgiving, can be described as ascetical practices. And by ascetical, I mean that we are intentionally choosing to deny ourselves certain things in order to bring ourselves into greater subjection to God, to establish virtue and rid ourselves of vice, and to intentionally pursue conversion in every part of our lives. For example, Christians have traditionally fasted on Fridays and during Lent as an ascetical discipline. These ascetical practices might be new to many unfamiliar to Anglicanism, but they are time-tested ways by which the church has sought to grow Christians in faith and holiness.